Okay, this presentation is on the respiratory system, and information about the respiratory system can be found in chapter 22 of your textbook. Specifically, if you could read the pages that I've listed below here from chapter 22, I think that would be really helpful. There are some questions in this presentation that I'm going to leave unanswered, and you can find the answers to those questions within your textbook. I just want to give credit to my favorite internet artist, who is age 6 and has drawn an excellent picture of the lungs. So the respiratory system. We can see the trachea here. We can even see little C cartilage. This is the xiphoid process of the sternum. We can see left and right bronchi and bronchioles, and then of course the lungs that are housing those bronchioles and bronchi. So in this diagram, in the center of the diagram, we see the heart. And the heart is actually made up of two separate pumps. The left side of the heart, which is this red part here, pumps oxygenated blood around to the body. And every single living cell in the body is in contact with a little blood vessel, a capillary, that supplies it with oxygen so that it can live and do its job. The cells also give off carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide then gets put back into the blood and gets shunted back to the other pump in the heart, the right side of the heart. And the right side of the heart then pumps that deoxygenated blood that is filled with carbon dioxide back to the lungs. And then within the lungs, an exchange takes place. In the air that we breathe in, there is oxygen, and that oxygen moves into the little blood vessels, and the carbon dioxide moves out of the blood and into these little air sacs in the lungs so that we can get rid of it. So that exchange between oxygen in and carbon dioxide out occurs in the lungs, and then the newly oxygenated blood then goes back to the left side of the heart, and the left side of the heart then continues to pump that around the body. And that's the cycle. And that's how the respiratory system fits in with our cardiovascular system to supply oxygen to every single living cell in our body and get rid of carbon dioxide. We can divide our respiratory system into two major parts: the upper part, upper respiratory tract, and the lower respiratory tract. So in the upper respiratory tract are all of the entrances for air, so our nostrils, nasal cavity, our oral cavity or mouth, and so air comes into our respiratory tract through those openings. And then it passes through the pharynx or throat. Our pharynx is actually a common passageway for both food and air. So food we would swallow and it would go down the esophagus, and of course air then comes through passes by the pharynx or throat through the larynx or our voice box, and then down the trachea. Once it passes down into the trachea, we are now in the lower respiratory tract, and so their trachea then divides into left and right passageways. These are called bronchi, and then into smaller and smaller passageways called bronchioles. We have two lungs, a right and a left lung. From a gross perspective, gross anatomy perspective, our right lung has 3 lobes, upper, middle, lower, and our left lung has 2 lobes, just upper and lower. So if we talk about an illness that is an upper respiratory illness, we're talking about an illness that is affecting this upper respiratory tract. So things like a sinus infection or laryngitis. Remember, itis is inflammation, so inflammation of the larynx is laryngitis. Or pharyngitis is inflammation of the throat or a sore throat. Sneezing, nasal drip, those are all upper respiratory tract infections or illnesses. If it's a disorder or an illness that affects the lower respiratory tract, then it's going to affect these structures in this section. So things like asthma, which is a disorder that affects the bronchioles and bronchi, those passages. Pneumonia, emphysema, bronchitis, those are all lower respiratory tract disorders. So if we take a closer look at the lower respiratory tract, this is the trachea right here, and it divides into two different bronchi, or singular bronchus, a left and a right bronchus. And these then divide into smaller and smaller passageways. Then the smaller ones are called bronchioles. And at the end of the smallest bronchioles are little tiny air sacs that look like clusters of grapes, and those are called alveoli. So based on your knowledge of lung anatomy, would you say, is this a left lung or a right lung? And if you said it was a left lung, then you would be correct. And you can tell based on its shape and how it would fit into the chest cavity, but also by the number of lobes. So this has 2 lobes, and so it's the left lung. I also just want you to note this is a very healthy lung. It's nice and pink, you know, when we look at some lungs that have some respiratory disorders, then you have something to kind of compare. So this is a nice, healthy left lung. Okay, so protecting our lungs, or our thoracic cavity, are ribs, and we have 12 different pairs of ribs. And in between our ribs we have muscles, and those are called intercostal muscles. And there are 2 layers of intercostal muscles: the outer layer, or external intercostal muscles, and an inner layer, internal intercostal muscles. And these muscles are important for being able to breathe. The bone that the ribs then attach to via with cartilage, so the bones aren't directly connected. There's a piece of cartilage in between the sternum, this big bone here, and each rib. And then there is a big muscle that separates the chest cavity or thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. And this is called the diaphragm, and this is another really important muscle that we use for breathing. Star, 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 an important concept in breathing and how the lungs are structured is the space between the lungs and the chest cavity wall. So if we take a look at this picture here, we can see this is lung, this is the chest cavity wall, and these are ribs that, for the sake of the diagram, have been cut off so that we can see inside. And in between the lung and the chest cavity wall is a space, and I say it's a space with quotation marks because it's a theoretical space, and it's called the pleural space. Now, this space actually has a negative pressure, and so what I want you to think of is let's say that you were holding a plastic bag in your hand, and you put a straw in that plastic bag, and you sucked out all the air in the bag. What happens to the bag? Right? The bag collapses and it pulls against itself, and kind of like, you know, when the 2 sides stick together. And so inside that bag there is a negative pressure, and that's what's holding the sides of the bag together. That's why they're stuck together. And so that's the same thing as in the lungs. So it's as if somebody put a straw into this space and sucked all the air out of this space, and then that suction, that negative pressure, then makes the lining of the lungs stick to the chest cavity wall. And because it sticks to the chest cavity wall, whenever we move our chest cavity, so when we're breathing in and out and contracting these muscles, then it also moves the lungs at the same time. So this keeps the lungs from collapsing. If by chance, if you were to get a hole in the chest cavity wall, so let's say a puncture wound of some sort, then air gets into this space, and now you've got a positive pressure, and that's why then the lungs will collapse. The lining of the lungs and the lining of the chest cavity are membranes, and those are called pleural membranes. And there's a pleural fluid that is secreted so that these lungs glide, even though they're stuck to the chest cavity wall, they can glide back and forth, and that helps during breathing as we're moving air in and out. So star, star, star. Again, the mechanics of how we actually get air in and out of our lungs. In order to get air to come into our lungs through our mouth and nose and down the trachea, we have to make this cavity bigger. And so by making it bigger, then there creates a little bit of a vacuum, and air then can rush in to fill that space. So in order to make our chest cavity bigger, we can do a couple things. One is that we can move our diaphragm, contract it, and move it down. So as we contract this muscle, it will move down and make a bigger space. And we can also use our external intercostal muscles, so the outside part of these muscles between the ribs, to contract, and that moves the rib cage up and outwards. And the combination of those contracting those muscles makes this space inside the chest cavity bigger, and then air rushes in down the trachea and then into that space. In order to breathe out, all we have to do is relax the diaphragm, and it pops back up into its U space when all we have to do is relax it. And then we relax our intercostal muscles, and that allows our rib cage to move down and in, and that shrinks the space in the chest cavity, and then air is pushed out of the lungs, and that is what exhalation is. So it's just a matter of moving those muscles. This is a quick animation. So when we're breathing in, our diaphragm contracts and moves down and flattens, and that makes this space bigger, and that allows the air to rush into our lungs. Our external intercostal muscles also make this space bigger as well. It's not shown on this animation. When we relax our diaphragm, it pops back up into place, into this U shape. That makes the space smaller, and that pushes air out of the lungs. I want you to do a little exercise. Okay, so I want you to breathe in and out normally. Okay, and then now I want you to breathe in normally, breathe out normally, right to the very end, and now try to push all the rest of the air out of your lungs. Okay, that's what we call forced expiration. So normally we're breathing a normal amount in and out. We call that tidal volume. That's the volume of air that under normal circumstances we breathe in and out with each contraction of our respiratory muscles. But we can force extra air out, and we can do that by using our internal intercostal muscles and our abdominal muscles and our transversus thoracis muscles. So those three muscles can contract, and that can actually squeeze the lungs a little bit more and force more air out. Just so that you know, we always have a reserve volume. There's always a certain amount of air that is always in the lungs that we can't force out. So even after forced expiration, after you've tried to force all the air out of your lungs that you can, there will still be an amount there that keeps the lungs inflated. So how fast do we normally breathe? Well, in adults, we normally take between 12 to 18 breaths per minute, and children, it's a little bit faster, so 25 to 30 breaths per minute. A couple terms that you should know is that if we are moving less air in and out, we call that hypoventilation, underventilation. So that could be that a person is breathing at a slower rate, or it could be that they're taking shallower breaths, but the volume of air moving in and out is less than what it's normally. If we are moving more air in and out than normal, we call that hyperventilation. So that could be fast respiratory rate, or it could be taking deep breaths, or a combination of both, and we call that hyperventilation. Okay, star, star, star. So our breathing is controlled by two main mechanisms. One is neural control. So there are several areas of the brain that control or influence our breathing. The most important areas of the brain are in the brain stem, the pons and the medulla specifically. And they set the basic breathing rhythm. So they tell through nerves that go to our breathing muscles. The phrenic nerve goes to our diaphragm, and our intercostal nerve goes to the intercostal muscles. So those are these two nerves. And it sends signals down these nerves to those muscles to set the rate of how fast we are going to, and deep are we going to breathe. These areas, particularly the medulla, are very, very sensitive to opioids, narcotics. And so that's why these drugs like fentanyl or morphine or those types of drugs, then they can influence and depress the activity in these in the pons and the medulla, and therefore decrease the amount that a person breathes. They will breathe shallower and they will breathe slower, to the point where they may not get enough oxygen and it can stop respiration entirely. And that's what happens with fentanyl overdoses. So nervous control is one control of respiration, and the other control is chemical. And so we have certain cells within our brain, in the brainstem, and cells that are located in the big arteries that leave the heart, our carotid arteries, and this one here, which is the big aorta, and that's another big vessel that leaves the heart. And these cells are specialized receptors called chemoreceptors, and they detect chemicals in the blood. Specifically, they detect carbon dioxide and oxygen, and they will also detect hydrogen ions, which is sort of a measure of acidity. Of the three chemicals, the most important regulator of respiration is carbon dioxide. So that is the main regulator of breathing. So what happens is that if we hold our breath, for example, carbon dioxide is not leaving our body. So it starts to build up in the blood, and it is sensed by these receptors in the medulla, and also sensed by receptors in the periphery, so in the carotid arteries. And then that sends a signal up to the medulla to increase our respiratory rate. We also have receptors that will respond to low levels of oxygen. So as we hold our breath, oxygen levels start to fall in the blood, and that is sensed in the aorta, and that sends a signal also up to these areas in the brain to increase respiratory rate. So this is why when you hold your breath, as you hold your breath, you start to feel that sensation that you need to breathe. And the longer you hold your breath, the stronger that sensation is. Your brain is saying, you need to breathe, you need to breathe, you need to breathe, you need to breathe. The reason that you're not is because we have some voluntary control, and it's suppressing those signals. Now eventually, if you held your breath long enough, you would faint. The oxygen levels in the brain would fall to the point where you would pass out. And then, of course, the brainstem would just take over, and you would just start breathing automatically. So if we look at the whole respiratory tract, right from where air enters the nose, the mouth, the throat, larynx, all the way down to the little alveoli or air sacs, air passes through this whole tract. We can divide the tract into two main parts. The conducting zone, and these are all structures that are responsible simply for passing air through. So getting air, transporting air from the environment down to where we can actually get it into the blood. So these are passageways for air, and they have some important jobs. They are important for filtering out debris. So all of these structures are lined with mucous membranes that produce mucus that will trap debris, and little cilia that will move that debris back up so that we can swallow it and get rid of it. So it's constantly cleaning out our respiratory passages. It also makes the air moister so that our little air sacs, when it gets down here, don't dry out. So that mucus contains moisture. As the air passes over the mucus, it picks up that moisture so that it's not as dry. And of course there are blood vessels that line all of these structures, and so as the air passes over the blood vessels, it gets warmed. And so by the time it hits down into our little air sacs again, the air is free of debris, it is humidified or moistened, and it's warmed. When we get down to our very smallest bronchioles, tiny passageways, and all of our little alveoli, this is called the respiratory zone. And by respiratory zone, I mean that's the site of gas exchange. So that's the point where oxygen will move from the air that we've breathed in into the blood, and where the blood will discharge its carbon dioxide, and that gets breathed out, and we get rid of that from the body. So that's what we call the respiratory zone. Okay, we're going to start a journey through the respiratory tract, and we're going to talk about relevant disorders or things that you should know as a DSW as we pass by them through those structures. So starting with the nose, air comes in through our nostrils and then into this big space here that we call our nasal cavity. At the very top of the nasal cavity are our olfactory receptors. So if you remember from last week, these are the receptors that respond to chemicals dissolved in this mucus, and they give us our sense of smell. The entire nasal cavity is lined with that mucous membrane. You can see down here, these are these little ciliated cells and cells that secrete mucus, and it moistens the air, traps debris, and the cilia moves the mucus to the pharynx, where we swallow it, and it actually goes down our esophagus. And our nasal cavity is also lined with very thin-walled veins, and of course if you strike the nose, these little veins will bleed, and that again causes a nosebleed. This structure right here is called the palate, and it separates the nasal cavity from the mouth. And part of that palate is bone, and part of it is connective tissue. Just as we're in this region, we'll talk briefly about our sinus cavities. So these are spaces within the skull, and they are really resonance chambers for speech. The cells that line these cavities produce mucus, and those cavities constantly drain then into the nasal cavity itself. And again, this is what the lining of the inside of a sinus cavity looks like. It's got cilia, and it produces mucus like the rest of the respiratory tract. So sometimes if we have a virus or some sort of allergen that causes an allergic reaction, it can cause the inside of these sinuses to become inflamed, and then excess mucus is produced. And of course that drains into the nasal cavity, and so that's what causes that congestion that we get when we're sick. That's also why it changes the voice quality, and so now you sound like this, because there's no resonance there. And it can create headaches because the inflammation can produce pain as well. Moving down to the pharynx or throat is that common passageway for both foods, liquids and solid foods, and air. So everything we breathe in and take into our mouth goes through the pharynx. After the pharynx, it separates, and air will go down the trachea into our respiratory tract, and food and liquids will go down our esophagus into our digestive tract. So it's this section right here. Pharyngitis is a fancy way of saying I have a sore throat. It's inflammation of the throat and can be caused by a number of different things. Viruses can cause sore throats. specifically Streptococcus bacteria, which causes strep throat, and that's what we see here in this picture. It's characterized by very red, little red dots. Sometimes we also see white pussy areas with strep throat, but also can be caused by irritants, things like smoke. Past the pharynx, air will now go into past the larynx, which is at the top of the trachea. So the larynx is the structure that contains our vocal cords, and as air passes over those vocal cords, they vibrate, and that allows us to produce sounds. We have muscles associated with that as well, and so we can change the quality of the sound by changing the shape of those vocal cords. The larynx functions as a couple things. It functions also as a valve that prevents air from escaping our lungs. We can close that off. So for example, if you're lifting weights, we close off that valve. It has a little flap right at the top of it called the epiglottis, which is this little flap here. And when we swallow, the epiglottis will cover the top of the trachea, and that will prevent food and things from going down into the trachea and into our respiratory tract. And it also helps us to forcefully expel foreign substances which may threaten the trachea, so we can build up pressure and cough to expel those types of foreign substances, and also then to produce sound. In males around puberty, testosterone causes the vocal cords to become longer and thicker, and that then causes the voice to deepen. So here are, on the left, this is their vocal cords here. So this is a view looking down the trachea from the top, and this is our larynx structure, and there are the vocal cords right there. And on the right, this is a picture from the outside. So this is trachea here, and this is the larynx. Number 1, this is the hyoid bone, H-Y-O-I-D bone. It's the only floating bone in the body, so it's not connected to a tissue like muscle or another bone. Number 2, this is the thyroid cartilage, and number 3 is the cricoids cartilage, so C-R-I-C-O-I-D-S. And together they make that structure that protects the larynx. Inflammation of the larynx is called laryngitis, and this is what we see here. This is an example of acute laryngitis, which means it comes on very suddenly and also goes away, and that's caused by some sort of infection, bacteria or a virus. We can also have chronic laryngitis, and so that's usually caused by an irritant of some sort, so something that is constantly irritating our larynx. So usually it's things like either air pollution or chronic exposure to smoke and smoking. When our larynx becomes inflamed, then the vocal cords change their shape, and that's going to then affect our ability to produce sound. On the left here, this is a tumor that has formed on the vocal cords. So this is laryngeal cancer, and this is almost exclusively caused by smoking. Our trachea is a long tube that connects our pharynx and larynx to the lungs, and it is also lined with that mucous membrane, so produces mucus with little cilia that pushes it to the pharynx to be swallowed. The outside of the trachea is held open by these rings of cartilage. Now these are C rings, so they're not a complete circle. They're open at the back, so this is a C shape, and they hold the trachea open. This is a look at the membrane, a closer look of the mucous membrane that lines the trachea with the ciliated cells and the mucus-producing cells. Again, if you smoke, then all of these cilia and these structures are dead. And so what happens is there's a compensatory response where the body produces more mucus in order to help trap the debris, but there's no cilia to move the mucus out. And so that's why people that smoke often have excess mucus production in their respiratory tract. A tracheostomy is where they take a tube and it's surgically inserted into the trachea. And usually it's to bypass some sort of obstruction in the airway above this. So sometimes, for example, with surgery, if they've had to remove the larynx, for example, or there's some sort of structural problem up here, then a person may have a tracheostomy and this tube is inserted to allow air to go in. Because this is the opening for air and there is mucus that is produced inside the trachea, then that mucus may require periodic suctioning in order to keep the airway clear. For some people, this is temporary. For other people, if they've had a section of their trachea removed, for example, because of cancer, then this will be a permanent structure. And this is something that you will learn in your residential health clinical skills in your second year of the program, is how to apply and suction a tracheostomy. Okay, this is the end of part 1. And there will be a part 2 as well, so make sure that you watch that part as well.